Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today into truth values. True or false, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's something that seems pretty basic at first,
Right.
but for philosophers and logicians, it gets really interesting.
And complicated, I bet.
Oh, yeah. Like, what does it even mean for something to be true?
I mean, I think I know, but maybe I don't.
That's what we're here to find out,
This will be a good one for our listeners who really like to think about this stuff.
for sure. And the good news is, we've got a great guide for this deep dive. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on truth values.
Perfect. So what are we going to try to figure out today?
Well, first, we're going to look at all the different ways people have tried to understand truth values. Like, what are they really?
Okay.
And then we'll see why they're so important in philosophy and logic. Because even though true and false seem simple, they have a pretty wild history.
Right.
Like, people have been arguing about this stuff for centuries.
Wow. Let's get into it then. So where do we even begin with truth values?
Well, there are a bunch of different ways to think about them.
Okay.
Some people say they're like basic abstract things that sentences refer to.
So like the truth value of the sky is blue is true.
Right. Others say they're more like categories we create by grouping similar sentences together.
Okay, so sentences that are true get grouped together and sentences that are false get grouped together.
Exactly. But it gets even more interesting.
How so?
Some philosophers say truth values are actually what we're aiming at when we make judgments. Like when we say something, we're trying to hit the target of truth.
That makes sense.
And then there's the idea of degrees of truth, where things aren't just true or false, but kind of in between.
Interesting.
And then there are truth values that help explain vagueness, like when things aren't clearly true or false.
Right.
But the really big question is, what are truth values themselves?
Right, like what are they made of?
Exactly. Are they just basic, undefined things? Or are they carefully defined? Or are they maybe even made up of smaller parts?
That's a lot to consider.
It is.
So with all these different ideas about truth values floating around, who really brought this concept to the forefront?
The big name here is Gottlob Frege.
Okay, I've heard of him.
He was a German philosopher and logician working in the late 1800s.
Right.
And he really made truth values a key part of his whole system of logic.
So what was his big idea?
Well, he said that sentences, like declarative sentences, the kind that make statements.
Right, like the cat is on the mat.
Yeah, exactly. He said those sentences are actually a kind of name.
A name.
Yeah, like a proper name, but instead of referring to a person or a place, they refer to, you guessed it,
Truth values.
bingo. He called them the true and the false, or in German, das Wahre and das Falsch.
So the cat is on the mat would be a name for the true if the cat really is on the mat.
Exactly, and if the cat's not on the mat, that sentence would be a name for the false.
That seems kind of strange.
I know, right? It's not how we usually think about sentences. But Frege had a good reason for thinking this way.
What?
It had to do with his idea about how language works, which he called functional analysis.
Okay, tell me about that.
So he divided expressions in language into two types, saturated and unsaturated.
Saturated and unsaturated. Like a sponge.
Kind of. Think of a saturated expression as a complete thought, like a proper name.
Like Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly. Abraham Lincoln refers to a specific person, all on its own.
Right.
Now, an unsaturated expression is more like
A recipe with a missing ingredient.
yes, or like a question waiting for an answer. They need something to complete them.
So like the capital of.
Perfect. The capital of needs a country to make a complete statement.
Right. The capital of France.
That refers to something specific, Paris.
So how do sentences fit in? Are they saturated or unsaturated?
Great question. Frege said they're saturated. They're complete thoughts. They don't need anything else to make sense.
Right. The cat is on the mat, stands on its own.
And since it's a complete thought, he figured it must refer to something.
And that something is a truth value.
You got it.
Oh, wait, what about things like is on the mat? That's not a complete sentence.
Good point. Those are called predicates, and Frege said they're unsaturated. They need an object to complete them.
Like the cat completes is on the mat to make a sentence.
Exactly, and this whole system of saturated and unsaturated expressions with truth values as the ultimate reference of sentences, well, it had a huge impact on logic.
Yeah, in what way?
Well, for one thing, it provided a unified way to understand how meaning works in language.
Okay.
Like it explained how different parts of a sentence contribute to the overall meaning, which is ultimately a truth value.
Right.
Plus, it helped make a clear distinction between different kinds of contexts in language.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you can substitute one word for another without changing the truth of a sentence.
Like George Washington and the first president of the United States.
Exactly. Those refer to the same person, so you can swap them out.
Right.
But
Yeah.
sometimes you can't do that. Frege's system helped explain why.
Oh, I see.
But for philosophers, the really big impact was on how we think about truth itself.
Okay. How so?
It raised all these questions about the nature of truth, the nature of logic, even the nature of reality.
Whoa. So Frege's idea about sentences referring to truth values really shook things up.
It did. But he didn't just come up with this idea out of thin air. He had a very specific reason for thinking this way.
What was that?
It all had to do with a principle called substitutivity.
Substitutivity. Sounds complicated.
It's not really. Basically, it says that if two things refer to the same thing, then you can substitute one for the other without changing the truth of a sentence.
Okay. Give me an example.
Sure. Let's say the morning star is bright is true.
Okay.
And we know that the morning star and Venus refer to the same planet.
Right.
So according to the principle of substitutivity, we should be able to replace the morning star with Venus without changing the truth value.
So Venus is bright would also be true.
Exactly. Frege thought this principle was really important, and he saw it as support for his idea that sentences refer to truth values.
I see. Because if two sentences have the same truth value.
Then they refer to the same thing, namely either the true or the false.
Right. But was there like a formal argument for that?
There is. It's called the slingshot argument. It was made famous by Alonzo Church, another logician.
Slingshot. As in like David and Goliath.
Yeah. It's a powerful argument that kind of knocks down other ideas about what sentences refer to.
Okay. How does it work?
Well, it involves a series of substitutions, kind of like a chain reaction.
Okay.
Each substitution seems perfectly valid on its own, but when you put them all together,
What happens?
you get this crazy conclusion that all true sentences must refer to the same thing, and all false sentences refer to the same thing.
That's wild. Can you give me a quick example?
Sure. Let's say we have two sentences. Sir Walter Scott wrote Waverley, and Sir Walter Scott is the guy who wrote 29 Waverley novels.
Okay.
We'll assume he really did write 29.
Right.
Those sentences seem to be talking about the same thing.
Yeah, they both mean that Scott wrote the book.
Now, we can rephrase that second sentence like this. The number of Waverley novels written by Sir Walter Scott is 29.
Okay.
That's just a different way of saying the same thing.
Right.
Now, let's say we have another sentence. The number of counties in Utah is 29.
What does that have to do with Scott?
Bear with me. If the number of Waverley novels written by Sir Walter Scott refers to the number 29, and the number of counties in Utah also refers to the number 29,
Hmm.
and if we can substitute things that refer to the same thing,
Then the sentence about Scott and the sentence about Utah must also refer to the same thing.
exactly. And what's the only thing they have in common?
Their truth value. They're both true.
Boom. That's the slingshot argument in a nutshell. It suggests that the only thing that really matters for the meaning of a sentence is its truth value.
Wow. That's pretty convincing, actually.
It is a strong argument, and it's been formalized using fancy logical tools like lambda calculus and all that.
Sounds impressive.
But of course, not everyone agrees with it.
Yeah, I was going to say, there must be some philosophers who object to this whole idea.
Oh, there are. Some philosophers think sentences refer to facts or propositions or other more complicated things.
Right.
But the slingshot argument is a big deal in the debate about truth values.
It definitely shows how important they are to the whole system.
It does. So we've talked about how Frege saw sentences as referring to truth values.
Right.
But in everyday language, we usually talk about truth as a property. Like we say, that statement is true.
True.
So how did Frege deal with that?
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction.
It does. But Frege had a clever response. He said that adding is true to a sentence doesn't really add any new information. Like saying it is true that snow is white is the same as just saying snow is white.
Yeah, you're right.
So for Frege, is true doesn't express a real property, but it's more like a way of emphasizing that we believe the sentence.
Okay, I see.
He thought the real focus should be on the truth value itself, not on truth as a property.
So for him, truth wasn't something that sentences had, but something they aimed at.
Exactly. And he had a pretty deep philosophical reason for thinking this way.
Okay, I'm all ears. What was it?
He was really concerned with making sure that knowledge and logic were grounded in something objective.
Objective, meaning outside of our own minds.
Exactly. He didn't want truth to be just a matter of personal opinion or belief.
Right.
So he thought that by making truth an object, a truth value, he could anchor it in something solid and independent.
I see. So truth values for him were like the foundation of logic and knowledge.
Exactly. Tyler Burge, another philosopher, put it really well. Normally the point of using sentences, what matters to us, is to claim truth for a thought. The object, in the sense of the point or objective, of sentence use was truth. It is illuminating, therefore, to see truth as an object.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we want our knowledge to be about something real, not just stuff we make up.
Exactly, and that's where truth values come in.
So Frege really brought this term truth value to the forefront of philosophy. But you mentioned earlier that the term itself was used before him, right?
Yeah, it pops up a bit earlier in the work of Wilhelm Windelband.
Okay, who was he?
He was a German philosopher, part of the Neo-Kantian movement.
Right.
He was interested in the idea of values in general, like moral values, aesthetic values.
Okay,
And he thought truth was also a kind of value, the value of truth.
makes sense.
He saw logic as the study of this value, just like ethics studies moral values.
Interesting. So Frege wasn't the first to use the term, but he definitely gave it a whole new meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Frege took that idea of truth as a value and combined it with his rigorous logical system.
Right.
He basically showed how truth values could be treated as objects within a formal system.
Yeah, he really formalized the whole thing.
Exactly. He said, a statement contains no empty place, and therefore we must take its Bedeutung as an object. But this Bedeutung is a truth value. Thus, the two truth values are objects.
Okay, I'm going to need you to translate that German word for me.
Oh, right. Bedeutung means, like, meaning or reference.
So a sentence as a complete statement refers to an object, and that object is a truth value.
Exactly. And since it's an object, it exists in its own right, independently of our minds.
So Frege really solidified this view of truth values as objects? Were there any philosophers who challenged this idea?
Yeah, Michael Dummett, a British philosopher, raised some important objections.
What did he say?
He thought Frege's idea of sentences as names was too simplistic.
Why?
Dummett argued that sentences have a special role in language. They're the things we use to express thoughts and make claims about the world.
Right.
And he thought that treating them as just another kind of name overlooked their unique function.
Interesting. So he wasn't totally on board with Frege's view.
Not completely. But even Dummett admitted that simply rejecting truth values as objects didn't really solve the problem.
So it's still a debate then.
It is. But Frege's ideas really changed the game when it comes to understanding truth.
They certainly gave philosophers a lot to think about. Now, we've been talking about truth bearers, the things that can be true or false. Does Frege's view of truth values as objects offer any insight into this debate?
It does. The traditional way of thinking about truth is to see it as a property.
Right.
So the question becomes, what kind of things have the property of being true?
Sentences, beliefs, propositions.
Exactly. And philosophers disagree about which of these are the real truth bearers.
So how does Frege's view help?
Well, if truth values are objects, then we can ask, what kind of things relate to the object, the true?
I see.
So instead of focusing on the property of being true, we focus on the relationship to the object, the true.
That's a good point. It takes the focus off the truth bearer itself.
Right. It simplifies things in a way. Instead of trying to figure out what has the property of being true, we just look at what points to the object, the true.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Does this connect to anything else in philosophy?
It does. It actually relates to Aristotle's idea of prose hen being.
Okay, remind me what that is.
It's the idea that a word can have multiple meanings, but they're all related to one central meaning.
Okay.
Like healthy can refer to a person, a diet, or an activity, but all those meanings are tied back to the idea of a healthy person.
Right.
So in the same way, true can be applied to sentences, beliefs, and propositions, but those uses might all be pointing back to the object truth.
So truth with a capital T is like the central meaning that all the other uses of true are related to.
Exactly. And this helps explain how we can use true in so many different ways.
That's a really cool connection. And what about contemporary perspectives on this? I know there are philosophers still working on these issues today.
Absolutely. A contemporary philosopher, Edward Zolta, has developed a sophisticated theory that draws inspiration from Frege.
Okay, tell me about that.
Zalta uses a system called object theory, and he says that truth isn't a property of objects in the usual sense, nor is it an object like, say, a chair or a number. Instead, he sees it as a mode of predication.
A mode of predication. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure. It's basically a way of saying that is true doesn't ascribe a property to a sentence or a proposition.
Right.
Instead, it indicates a special relationship between that sentence or proposition and the truth value itself.
So it's not a property, but a kind of relation.
Exactly. And he uses Tarski's famous T-schema to make this point.
Okay, the T-schema.
It's that formula that says snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
Right.
Zalta says this shows that truth is more about a connection between a statement and reality than a property of the statement itself.
That's really interesting. It seems like there are so many different ways to think about truth and truth values.
There really are.
Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about truth values as these abstract objects, but if we accept that they are objects, what kind of objects are they?
Well, the general consensus is that they're abstract objects, similar to numbers or sets.
So they don't exist in space and time like physical things?
Exactly. Frege called them logical objects, and Alonzo Church, another important logician, also classified them as abstract.
So they're more like concepts or ideas than physical things.
Precisely. They belong to that realm of abstract entities that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right.
And just like with any kind of object, we need to figure out what makes two truth values the same or different.
Good point. Like, how do we know that two different sentences are both referring to the same truth value?
Right. And the most common way to determine this when it comes to truth values is to look at logical equivalence.
Okay, so if two sentences are logically equivalent, they have the same truth value.
Right. Anderson and Zalta, two contemporary philosophers, gave a more precise definition.
What did they say?
They said that the truth value of a proposition P is identical to the truth value of another proposition Q if and only if P and Q non-logically equivalent.
And non-logically equivalent, so they have the same truth value under all possible circumstances.
Exactly. And this idea was actually hinted at earlier by Carnap, who compared truth values to extensions of predicates.
Extensions.
It's the set of all things a predicate applies to.
Oh, right. Like the extension of is red would be the set of all red things.
Precisely. And he said that just like two predicates have the same extension, if they apply to the same objects, two sentences have the same truth value if they're logically equivalent.
Makes sense. But there's a catch, right?
Always a catch.
What is it?
This whole idea of logical equivalence depends on what logical system you're working with.
Ah, so the same two sentences might have different truth values in different systems of logic.
Exactly. What counts as logically equivalent can change depending on the rules of the game.
That's important to keep in mind.
It is. It shows how deeply intertwined logic and truth are. But there's another important aspect of truth values to consider, and that's their role as logical values.
Okay, we haven't really talked about that yet.
Right. Frege himself suggested that true is what defines the whole subject matter of logic, just like beautiful defines aesthetics and good defines ethics.
So logic is about the laws of being true.
Exactly. And if the true is an object, then logic is about the properties and relationships of that object and its opposite, the false.
I see. And Lucas Siewitz, who we mentioned earlier, really ran with this idea, didn't he?
He did. He said that truth and falsehood are singular logical objects, like the numbers 0 and 1 in math.
Okay.
He even said that logic is the science of these logical values.
So valid reasoning and inference, all that stuff, it's ultimately grounded in the nature of the true and the false.
Right. A valid inference is one that preserves the truth value, the true. That's why the rules of logic work so well.
Because they're tracking these fundamental truth values.
Exactly. And these values, they exist in Frege's famous third realm.
The third realm.
Yeah, it's this realm of abstract, mind-independent objects that includes logical and mathematical entities.
Okay, so truth values are right up there with numbers and sets.
They are. But Frege was very strict about having only two truth values.
Right, true and false. No in-betweens.
Exactly. But as logic developed, people started to explore the idea of having more than two truth values.
Ah, so that's where we get many-valued logics.
You got it.
So tell me about those. Why would you want more than two truth values?
Well, there are a few reasons. Sometimes the world just doesn't seem so black and white.
Right.
Like, what about statements about the future? Are they true or false now?
That's a good point.
Lukasiewicz, who we talked about earlier, was really interested in that question.
Yeah.
And independently, Emil Post was exploring the mathematical possibilities of having more than two truth values.
Okay.
He wasn't so concerned with the philosophical stuff.
Gotcha. So how do these many-valued logics actually work?
They use something called valuation systems.
Valuation system.
Basically, it's a way of setting up the rules for how truth values work in a particular logic.
Okay.
You have a set of truth values which can be more than just true and false. And then you have a special subset of those values that are considered designated, or like the good ones.
So kind of like true and classical logic.
Exactly. And these designated values are what you need to have for an argument to be valid.
Okay.
And then you have functions that define how connectives, like and or, work with all those truth values.
It sounds pretty complicated.
It can be. Sometimes people use the terms quasi-truth values or truth degrees.
Okay.
Gottwald, a logician who worked on this stuff, said we should stick with truth degrees when we have lots of truth values.
Okay.
So like in classical logic, a sentence is a tautology if it's always true no matter what.
Right.
In these systems, it's a tautology if it always gets one of the designated values.
Makes sense.
And then there's entailment, like when one sentence follows logically from another,
Right.
it's defined as preserving designated values.
Mm.
So if the premises of an argument have designated values, and the conclusion also has a designated value under those same conditions, then the argument's valid.
So it's like the truth or the designatedness flows from the premises to the conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay, but can you give me some concrete examples of these many-valued logics?
Absolutely. Two well-known examples are Kleen's logic, called K3, and Priest's logic, called P3.
Okay.
Both of those have three truth values: true, false, and a third one, usually called indeterminate.
Okay.
But they differ in which values are designated.
How so?
In Kleen's logic, only true is designated, while in Priest's logic, both true and indeterminate are designated.
Interesting. So Priest's logic allows for a kind of both true and false situation.
Right. You can think of it like this. In Kleen's logic, the indeterminate value means we don't know if it's true or false.
Makes sense.
But in Priest's logic, it means it's both true and false, like in a paradox.
Okay, I see.
Another way to think about these truth values is as sets of the classical truth values, true and false.
Okay, how does that work?
So true would be the set containing only true.
Okay.
False would be the set containing only false.
Yeah.
And then in Kleen's logic, indeterminate would be the empty set because it contains neither true nor false.
Right, right.
But in Priest's logic, indeterminate would be the set containing both true and false.
Ah, because it's both.
Exactly. And this idea of representing truth values as sets becomes really important when you get to Belknap's four-valued logic.
Four valued.
Yeah.
So we've got even more truth values now.
We do.
Tell me about it.
Belknap's logic, it's called B4. And it has truth values for all the possible combinations of true and false.
So there's true, false.
There's neither, which is like the empty set, neither true nor false.
Right.
There's true only, false only.
Okay.
And then there's both.
Wow, so it covers all the bases.
It does. And this system is really good for dealing with situations where you might have incomplete or contradictory information.
Like if you're getting data from different sources and they don't agree.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
It is. And the logical consequence relation in B4 is the same as the logic of first-degree entailment, which is a big deal in relevance logic.
Okay, I'm going to take your word for it on that one.
No problem. But the cool thing is that even with all these different truth values, these systems still have many of the same properties as classical logic.
Like what?
Well, they still have things like reflexivity, monotonicity, and cut.
Can you refresh my memory? What are those again?
Reflexivity means that any sentence follows from itself.
Okay, that makes sense.
Monotonicity means that if a sentence follows from a set of premises, it still follows if you add more premises.
Right.
And cut means that if you can derive a sentence from a set of premises and then use that sentence to derive another sentence, you can cut out the middleman and just derive the final sentence directly from the original premises.
Okay, I see. So these properties are about how sentences relate to each other in a logical system.
Exactly. And the fact that these many-valued logics have those properties shows they're still dealing with valid reasoning, even if they have different ideas about truth.
It's like they're expanding the possibilities of logic without breaking the fundamental rules.
Exactly. And these expanded possibilities can help us tackle some really tough philosophical problems, like the problem of vagueness.
Okay, yeah, vagueness, that's a big one.
It is. Like, how do we deal with terms like tall or heap that don't have clear boundaries.
Right. Like how many grains of sand does it take to make a heap?
Exactly.
And how tall does someone have to be considered tall?
Right. And this is where truth values, particularly in these many-valued systems, can really shine.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, instead of saying things are just true or false, we can use truth degrees to represent how true something is.
So it's like a scale from completely false to completely true.
Exactly. And fuzzy logic is a really good example of this.
Fuzzy logic, I've heard that term before.
Yeah, it was developed by Lotfi Zedek. He used fuzzy sets, where elements can belong to a set to a certain degree.
So it's not just in or out, but like partially in.
Right. And you can represent those degrees of membership using numbers from 0 to 1.
Okay, I see.
And these numbers can act as truth values for vague predicates.
So instead of saying John is tall, is simply true or false.
You might say it has a truth degree of, say, 0.8.
Okay, so he's pretty tall.
Right. And fuzzy logic has been used to try to solve the Sorites paradox, the heap of sand problem.
Right. Tell me how that works.